The Ember Plains stretched far beyond the eye's reach, an endless expanse of charred earth and smoke that swallowed everything in its wake. Beneath the relentless heat of the sun, the air shimmered with a constant, oppressive haze, the kind that made it seem as though the very sky itself was burning. There was no shelter here, no refuge from the storms that tore across the land, those firestorms that arrived without warning, sweeping like creatures of pure fury, devouring the earth with every gust of wind. And yet, despite the inferno's ceaseless wrath, there was something worse beneath the surface, something older and far more dangerous than the flames themselves. For years, the Ember Plains had been a mystery, an ancient terror that few dared to approach. Legends said that beneath the blackened earth, creatures of living fire slumbered, bound by an ancient curse to rise again should the land ever be disturbed. Those few who had ventured into the plains never returned. Some believed the firestorms were the creatures' awakening, a warning to stay away. Others thought the plains were cursed beyond any measure, a place where the earth itself burned with the sins of the past. But no one had ever stayed long enough to truly understand. And those who did, well, they didn't live to tell the tale. I had heard the whispers, the stories from the distant villages, the warnings of those who had seen the flames creeping over the horizon, who had watched in horror as the firestorms ravaged everything in their path. Some of them spoke of shapes moving in the smoke, strange and terrible forms that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though made of nothing but heat and light. But those were just stories. Stories passed down for generations, half forgotten, exaggerated over time. Or so I thought. It was supposed to be a simple expedition. I had been sent by the guild, tasked with mapping the Ember Plains, to understand its geography, to uncover the truth of the firestorms that had begun to spread further from the center of the plains into the surrounding territories. There were rumors that the storms were getting stronger, more frequent, and nobody knew why. No one had ever ventured to the heart of the plains, where the firestorms were said to originate, and the guild thought it would be useful to gather some real data. I should have known better, but I was young, eager, and foolhardy. I believed the stories were just that, stories, and I thought my knowledge, my experience, would be enough to survive the harsh conditions. How wrong I was. We set out in a small group, 4 of us, all skilled in survival, all experienced with the dangers of the wilderness. But none of us had ever faced anything like the Ember Plains. The further we traveled into the heart of the region, the more oppressive the air became, as if the very atmosphere itself was thick with something we could not touch but could feel. Every breath burned, as if the air itself had been tainted by the flames that raged just beyond the horizon. We had made camp one evening, after a long day of trekking through the blackened earth, when the first firestorm hit. It came without warning, a wall of heat and fury, a sudden and blinding surge of fire that swept over the landscape like a tidal wave. We barely had time to react. The winds howled, carrying the flames with them, twisting and bending in ways that seemed unnatural. There was no shelter to be found, no place to hide. We had to run. The firestorm roared past us, so close that I could feel the heat searing my skin, smell the stench of burning flesh and wood. The wind screamed in my ears, and I could hear the crackling of the flames as they consumed everything in their path. It was like being caught in the maw of some ancient beast, its hunger endless, its rage boundless. But worse than the storm itself was the feeling that we weren't alone. I could hear something else amidst the roar of the wind, a sound like a whisper carried on the breeze. Low, guttural, like the growl of something deep beneath the earth. My companions, too, seemed to hear it. We all froze, eyes wide with fear, straining to hear through the deafening chaos. But it was gone just as quickly as it had come. We didn't talk about it. We had enough to worry about with the storm bearing down on us, and no one wanted to admit that something was wrong beyond the flames. But that feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind, like something watching us from the shadows of the burning land. The storm passed by as quickly as it had arrived, leaving us shaken and exhausted. We gathered what little gear we had left, surveying the damage to our camp. It was clear we would have to push forward. There was no turning back now. The storm had already driven us deeper into the plains. It was as we walked, our faces grim with the weight of the storm's aftermath, that I first noticed it. A faint tremor in the ground, almost imperceptible at first, like the land itself was breathing. And then I heard it again, that same low, guttural growl, but this time it was louder. Closer. I turned to my companions, but they were already looking at me with wide eyes, their faces pale. The growl grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the wind or the crackle of the flames. It was something alive, something waiting. We stopped, our hearts racing as the ground beneath our feet seemed to hum with a strange energy. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though the firestorm had left something behind, something that was now stirring beneath the surface. The land was alive in a way that was not natural, not right. I could feel the heat rising from the earth itself, seeping into my bones, burning with an intensity that made it hard to think, to breathe. And then the ground erupted. From beneath the blackened earth, a massive pillar of fire shot up, twisting and writhing like a serpent, a column of flame that reached high into the sky. It was followed by another, and another, until the entire plain seemed to tremble with the force of the awakening. The fire tore through the earth in great waves, sending ash and cinders into the air, and I saw them, creatures made entirely of flame, their forms twisting and shifting in the heat, their bodies writhing like molten tendrils. They were massive, towering over us, their eyes burning with a hunger that was older than the land itself, and they were moving toward us. I barely had time to react before one of the creatures lunged, its fiery tendrils snapping toward me. The heat was unbearable, the intensity of the flames overwhelming, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. All I could do was watch as the creature drew closer, its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the air around me crackle with the power of its presence. I didn't know what they were, these creatures of fire. I didn't know if they were real, or if the heat had driven me mad. But I knew one thing for certain. They were alive, and they were angry. And if we didn't move, we would burn with the land. The air shimmered with heat, distorting the plain around me as the fiery creatures advanced. Each step they took seemed to burn the earth beneath them, leaving trails of molten rock and sparks that rose like small, angry suns. My companions scrambled beside me, their shouts lost in the roar of the flames. I wanted to call to them, to urge them to move faster, but my throat felt as if it had been filled with ash. I stumbled forward, my boots crunching over blackened soil, my lungs aching from the heat and smoke that clung to every breath. We ran blindly, guided only by instinct and the faint hope that the creatures would not be able to pursue us forever. But as the flames licked the air behind us, I realized with horror that these were not ordinary fires. They were thinking, aware, tracking us, shaping themselves around the terrain to cut off our escape. I risked a glance back and saw one of the creatures split into tendrils, each writhing in the air, creating a net of fire that stretched across the plain. It was deliberate, calculating, like a predator anticipating its prey's every move. The sight made my stomach turn. I had read about firestorms before, about natural wildfires and volcanic eruptions, but this was something alive, something ancient. The legends had been true. My mind raced. There had to be a way to survive, a pattern to their movements that we could exploit. I focused on the rhythm of the flames, noticing the slight hesitation before each tendril struck. The creatures seemed to draw strength from the earth itself, feeding off its heat, its very substance. But if they drew power from the ground, then maybe if we stayed off it, if we moved carefully along the patches that hadn't yet burned, we could slow them down. I shouted to my companions, and we changed direction, hopping over scorched pits, vaulting across cracked earth. Sparks seared our skin, the heat pressing down like a living weight, but we moved with desperate precision, each step measured, each breath a gamble. And then I saw it. A fissure in the ground, a dark, gaping wound that split the plain like a jagged scar. Smoke poured from its depths, and I had a sickening intuition. This fissure was older than the firestorms, older than the legends, and it pulsed with a heat that seemed almost alive. I realized with a jolt that the creatures were emerging from here, rising from the core of the Ember Plains itself. They weren't just wandering fires, They were guardians of something buried deep beneath the surface, something that demanded worship through destruction. One of my companions, Jorin, slowed, staring down into the fissure as if hypnotized. It's calling to them, he whispered. His voice trembled. It's like it knows we're here. I grabbed his arm, shaking him. Move! Now! He snapped out of it, and we leapt away from the edge just as a column of fire erupted, narrowly missing us. The force of it threw me forward, and I landed on my hands and knees, coughing, my eyes stinging from the smoke. When I looked up, the creatures were closing in again, their tendrils coiling like serpents, their eyes glowing brighter, hungrier. Panic clawed at me, but I forced it down. Panic would get us killed faster than the flames ever could. I had to think, to find a weakness, a way to survive. And then I saw it. The creatures avoided stepping on the cracked, ashen ridges. They followed the softer, darker soil, the patches where the heat seemed to breathe from below. The very earth they drew their strength from dictated their movement. Follow me, I shouted, pointing toward a narrow stretch of cracked, blackened ground. We ran in a zigzag pattern, dodging their fiery tendrils, keeping to the brittle ridges that the creatures couldn't cross. For a moment it worked. They hesitated, frustrated, and the distance between us grew. But the Ember Plains were unforgiving. The further we went, the more the ground beneath our feet began to shift, the earth trembling as though the plain itself was aware of our defiance. A new wave of heat surged up from the fissures below, hotter and more violent than anything we had faced so far. The air ignited with the scent of burning metal and sulfur, and I realized with horror that the creatures were not just chasing us. They were commanding the land, awakening it, turning it into a weapon. We had no choice. We had to reach the edge of the plains before it was too late. I didn't know how far we had to go, but I could feel the pulse of the fire beneath us, a heartbeat older than civilization, and it was growing faster, angrier. And then I felt it, a searing pain across my arm. I looked down and saw one of the tendrils, a ribbon of molten fire, wrapping around me. I screamed, yanking it off, but it burned through my sleeve and singed my flesh. The pain was unbearable, yet I had no time to stop. The creatures were closing in, circling us, herding us like prey into the open. In that moment, a terrible thought struck me. The firestorms, the creatures, the restless earth, they weren't just defending the plains. They were waiting for something or someone, and we had stumbled into their trap. I could see my companions faltering, their movements becoming sluggish, their faces streaked with soot and blood. Each step felt like wading through molten lead. And still, I forced myself onward, driven by a stubborn, desperate hope that survival was possible. Ahead, the horizon shimmered in a heat haze, the sun a dull, burning eye above the endless blackened fields. But something else caught my attention. A faint glimmer, like a reflection of fire against stone, partially buried in the cracked earth. My curiosity burned alongside the terror, a dangerous blend of fear and fascination. I knew instinctively that whatever lay there was the key to everything, the source of the plains' fury, the origin of the creatures. And if I could reach it, maybe, just maybe, I could survive. I ran faster, the creature's tendrils snapping at my heels, the ground quaking beneath me. Every nerve in my body screamed to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. Something ancient and terrible was calling me forward, a dark promise buried in the Ember Plains, and I had no choice but to answer. The fire around me flared higher, and the ground beneath my feet began to crack and shift, sending waves of molten rock shooting toward me. I leapt over a widening fissure, landing heavily on the other side, my lungs burning, my heart hammering. And then I saw it clearly, a shard of black stone, embedded in the earth, glowing faintly from within, like it contained a flame of its own. It was beautiful in a way that made my blood run cold, a dark, seductive beauty that promised power and death in equal measure. I reached for it, drawn by an impulse I could not resist, ignoring the heat, ignoring the screams of my companions behind me, ignoring the inferno that was closing in. And as my fingers brushed the surface of the shard, a voice echoed in my mind. Not a voice I had heard, but one that seemed to rise from the plains themselves, ancient and terrible. Welcome, the fire surged around me, and I understood, in that instant, the true horror of the Ember Plains. We had not stumbled upon them, they had been waiting for us. And now there was no escape. The ground trembled violently, the creatures roaring in unison, and the shard pulsed, sending a shockwave of heat and light that seared my vision. I felt my body being lifted, consumed, not by the fire outside, but by the flame within the stone itself. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that the Ember Plains had claimed me, and that the plains never let go. The shard burned like ice in my hand, a paradox of cold and heat that made my skin crawl. The flames around me seemed to bow to it, writhing and twisting with unnatural purpose, and I could feel the pulse of the Ember Plains itself radiating through the stone. It was alive and it was hungry. I fell to my knees, the heat of the land pressing down like a physical weight, my lungs ragged with the effort of breathing. The creatures circled closer, their tendrils snapping and coiling, each movement deliberate and predatory. And then, without warning, the shard pulsed violently, and a wave of energy shot through me, tearing at my mind with visions I could not comprehend. I saw firestorms that stretched across entire continents, consuming forests, villages, even mountains. Yet beneath the devastation, the creatures moved with purpose, hurting something unseen. I saw civilizations rise and fall, each leaving behind remnants buried in the earth, feeding the plains, strengthening its pulse. And I saw myself, not as I was, but as something else, a vessel chosen, cursed to walk among the flames. The shard hummed, and the creature's howls shifted into a chorus, a language older than time itself. I could feel their thoughts, their hunger, their desire to reclaim what had been lost long ago. And I understood, with horrifying clarity, that the Ember Plains were not just a place. They were a being, and we were trespassers in its mind, its body, its fire. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, as though the very air resisted me. My companions were shouting, their voices distant, muffled by the thrumming of the shard. I realized with a sinking dread that they were being drawn toward it too, that the shard's pull was irresistible, a dark siren calling us into the heart of the plains. The earth shook violently, and cracks ripped open beneath our feet, spewing molten rock and flame. One of my companions, Ilara, screamed as a tendril of fire snatched her, dragging her into the inferno. I tried to reach her, to pull her back, but the shard held me fast. I could only watch as her screams were swallowed by the roar of the Ember Plains, leaving only silence and ash. Panic clawed at me, but then a voice, my own, whispered through the shard, steady and cold. Do not fight. Understand. I forced myself to focus, and the visions returned, clearer this time. The creatures were not mindless. They were guardians, protectors of the shard, of the plains' memory. Everything burned to feed it, to awaken it. The firestorms were just the surface, the beginning of a process far greater and darker than anything humanity had faced. And the shard was the core, the heart of the Ember Plains, the source of the creature's consciousness. The pull intensified, and I felt my consciousness stretch, merge with the shards. Memories not my own surged through me. Flames devouring ancient cities, civilizations kneeling before the molten guardians, sacrifices made to appease a fire older than the sun. And beneath it all, a whisper of promise. Power beyond mortality, if I yielded. I screamed and tried to resist, but it was useless. The shard's pulse was the pulse of the plains, and the plains did not let go. Suddenly, the world around me changed. The flames receded into the distance. The heat became unbearable yet strangely comforting, and the ground beneath my feet no longer felt solid. I was suspended in a void of fire and shadow, surrounded by the writhing shapes of the flame creatures. They didn't attack. They watched, curious, patient, waiting for me to understand. And I did. I understood that survival was no longer about fleeing. It was about acknowledgement, about offering myself to the Ember Plains without fear, without resistance. The creatures, the shard, the firestorms, they were all part of a cycle, a dark ecosystem of flame and memory, and I was now a part of it too. I stepped forward, letting the shard guide me. My body burned, my skin melted, yet it did not kill me. Pain became clarity, agony became vision, and I could see the entire plane in a single horrifying glance. The dormant fires beneath the surface, the vast network of energy and consciousness connecting every inch of scorched earth. Then, the shard pulsed one final time, and I felt my mind expand, becoming one with the Ember Plains. I saw the horizon ripple with fire, the storms moving with intent, the creatures awakening in response to some ancient rhythm. And I knew, with terrible certainty, that I would never leave this place. Not as I had entered, not as myself. The flames surged around me, and my last thought, before I dissolved into the fire, was this. The Ember Plains were alive, and now so was I. I had become part of the walking fire. The world around me twisted and burned, but it no longer felt like the searing agony I had once known. The fire, the heat, the intense pressure. It was all part of me now, coursing through my veins like molten lava. I could feel the ancient rhythm of the Ember Plains deep inside, resonating with something that was no longer entirely human. The pain had faded into an overwhelming awareness, a connection to the very core of the land itself. The fire no longer burned me. It was me. I opened my eyes, or I think I did, because the landscape before me shifted with an eerie clarity, like the world had been drawn in a series of jagged lines, each one traced with flame. I could see the creatures now, not as beasts but as part of a vast living network. Their bodies were fire, but their minds, their thoughts, were bound together in a way that was both alien and familiar. I could hear them now, not through sound, but through the pulse of the earth, through the heat of the flame. It was a language of fire, of heat, of ancient desire. They were not just protectors. They were the custodians of something far older than the world itself. And I was one of them now. I felt it deep in my bones. I was no longer the person I had been. The shard had consumed me, but in doing so, it had changed me. I had become part of the Ember Plains, an extension of its will, its fire, its endless hunger. The plains were alive, and now I was a part of that life, bound to it in ways that defied understanding. I could feel every crack in the earth, every tremor beneath the surface, every pulse of heat that surged upward. I could hear the whispers of the past, the cries of the land that had burned for centuries, feeding the flames that had always burned within. And in the distance I saw it, the heart of the plains, a chasm where the firestorms gathered, where the creatures came to rest, to regroup, to feed. It was an ancient place, older than any civilization, older than the world itself. I could sense it in the air, a feeling of terrible inevitability. The firestorms were not just random acts of destruction. They were part of a cycle, a ritual that had been repeating for longer than any living being could comprehend. I felt a tug, an irresistible pull to move toward the heart of the plains, to join the creatures that had once seemed so alien, so monstrous. But now they were my kin. I was one of them, and as I moved, my body shifting with the rhythm of the land, I could feel the transformation taking place within me. I was becoming something else, something terrible, something eternal. The creatures followed, their fiery bodies coiling and twisting around me like an ever-present storm. Their eyes, fiery embers in the dark, watched me with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. They knew what I was becoming. They could feel the change as much as I did. The land had called to me, chosen me, and now I would carry out its will. I reached the chasm at the heart of the plains, the place where the firestorms began. The air was thick with heat, the ground quaking beneath my feet. The creatures gathered around, their bodies flickering in and out of existence as they circled the chasm, waiting for something, waiting for me. The chasm was alive. It was a wound in the earth, a gaping maw that seemed to pulse with a dark, ancient power. I could feel it calling to me, drawing me closer, and I understood in that moment the true nature of the Ember Plains. It was not just a place of fire. It was a prison, a seal that held something far more dangerous beneath the surface. The creatures, the storms, the fire, it was all part of the mechanism that kept the prison intact. And I had been chosen, not to destroy it, but to awaken it. The firestorms were not just a result of the land's fury. They were a warning that the seal was weakening, that the prison beneath the earth was starting to break open. And when it did, the flames would consume everything. Not just the Ember Plains, but the world itself. I could feel the power rising within me, the power of the shard, of the fire, of the land. It was time to act, time to fulfill my purpose. I stepped forward, my body becoming one with the flames, and I placed my hand against the chasm's edge. The heat was unbearable, but I didn't flinch. I could feel the earth shifting, the ancient energy of the land coursing through me. The creatures began to move, circling faster, their fiery tendrils stretching toward the chasm, feeding into it. The firestorm that had once been so chaotic, so destructive, began to take shape, its purpose becoming clear. I knew what had to be done. I had to release the energy, to let the fire consume the land, to open the prison and let the ancient power beneath the earth rise. But as I reached for the heart of the chasm, a terrible realization struck me. There was no going back. Once I began, once the seal was broken, there would be no stopping it. The flames would burn everything. The land, the creatures, the world, it would all be consumed. I was not just awakening the fire. I was unleashing it. And as the power surged through me, I knew that I had already made my choice. The ground beneath me trembled violently, and the sky above shattered into 1,000 fiery shards. The chasm opened wider, revealing the dark, ancient force that lay beneath. The true heart of the Ember Plains, a prison of fire and shadow that had been waiting for this moment. The creatures howled in unison, their voices merging into a single, deafening roar. The firestorms began to take shape, swirling in a massive vortex of flame and ash. The earth cracked open, and from the depths, a figure emerged. A being of pure flame, its body twisting and shifting like a storm made flesh. I knew it then. The creatures were not just guardians. They were the prison's wardens, and I had set them free. The figure towered over me, its eyes burning with an ancient, terrible intelligence. It reached out, its fiery tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me into the heart of the flame. And as I was consumed, I heard the voice again. Welcome home. The firestorm raged across the Ember Plains, consuming everything in its path. The land, the creatures, the world. They were all swept into the flames. And deep beneath the earth, the ancient prison shattered, releasing the force that had been contained for millennia. And with it, I became something more, something endless. The Ember Plains would burn forever, and I would walk among the flames for eternity. The world I had once known was gone, consumed by fire and shadow, and I was no longer a part of it. The Ember Plains had claimed me, body and soul. The firestorms raged with an intensity that could not be measured, an endless blaze that spread beyond the horizon, swallowing everything in its path. I was the fire now, a living embodiment of the flames that had once been so distant, so foreign to me. But now they were my language, my essence. The transformation was complete. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones, in the way my heart pulsed with the rhythm of the land. I was no longer human. The shard had burned away what remained of my flesh, my thoughts, my fears. What I had become was something far older, far more powerful. The creatures, those flame-born guardians, circled around me now, not as prey, but as allies, as extensions of my will. They had once been my captors, but now they were my kin. We were bound together, a collective consciousness of fire and rage, and we were unstoppable. I wandered the plains, my steps leaving scorched earth in their wake. The firestorms were no longer chaotic, no longer random. They were my creations, born from my will, and they spread like a virus across the land, consuming everything in their path. The villages, the forests, the mountains. Nothing could withstand the relentless heat. And as the fire spread, I could feel the souls of those who had perished burning with it, feeding the flames, adding to the power that coursed through me. But it wasn't just the land that had changed. It was the sky. The very fabric of reality itself seemed to warp and twist around the Ember Plains, as though the fire had altered the rules of the world. The sun, once a distant and comforting presence, was now a bleeding orb in the sky, its light dim and distorted. The stars, too, had changed. They were no longer the twinkling beacons of hope they had once been. Now they flickered like embers in a dying fire, and I knew that the world was on the brink of something far worse than a mere destruction of the land. The creatures, my creations, continued their relentless march across the plains, feeding the fires, waking the sleeping embers beneath the earth, and awakening new horrors with every passing moment. The land was alive, a twisted reflection of the flame that had consumed it. The earth trembled beneath my feet, and I could feel the ancient force below the surface stirring, as if the prison that had held it for so long was slowly beginning to break apart. The creatures, the fire, the storms, they were merely the heralds of something far darker. I could hear it now, beneath the roar of the firestorm. A whisper, a deep, primal voice, ancient and terrible. It spoke in the language of the flames, a language I could now understand. The time has come, it said, its words vibrating through the very core of my being. The land is ours to burn. The world is ours to claim. And in that moment I understood. The prison beneath the earth was not just a place. It was a force, a being. And it had been waiting for me. It was awake now. It was free. The firestorm reached its peak, the flames rising higher and higher, devouring everything in their path. The plains burned, the sky cracked open, and the ground split beneath the weight of the ancient power that had been released. The earth trembled as if it, too, was awakening to its new reality. I stood at the center of it all, a conduit between the fire and the land, between the creatures and the ancient force beneath. The power coursed through me, a torrent of heat and energy, and I felt my body, my soul, stretching beyond the confines of human existence. I was becoming something else, something vast, something eternal. And then, the voice spoke again, not just in my mind, but through the very air itself. You are the flame, it said. You are the vessel. You are the beginning and the end. The fire swirled around me, and I could feel the Ember Plains stretching outward, the flames consuming everything, sweeping across the world like a tide. The storm had grown, feeding on the destruction, its power increasing with each passing moment. It was unstoppable now, a force that would burn the world to the ground. But even as the fire spread, I felt the stirrings of something deeper beneath the surface. The force beneath the earth was awakening fully now, its power rising like a shadow in the flames. I could feel its presence, its hunger. It was not just the flames that had been released. It was something else, something far older, far darker, and it had been waiting for me. You have set us free, the voice whispered, and now we shall rise. The ground shook violently as the chasm at the heart of the plains split wide open, and from the depths, something vast and terrible emerged. It was not a creature, not in the way I had once understood creatures to be. It was a force of nature, a being born from the earth itself, from the core of the Ember Plains. Its shape was impossible to comprehend, a swirling mass of fire and shadow, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to consume everything around it. I felt it reach for me, its presence melding with mine, merging with the fire within me. The transformation was complete. I was no longer a person, no longer a being of flesh and bone. I was fire. I was the Ember Plains. I was the force that would consume the world and reshape it in the image of flame. And then, as the firestorms continued their relentless march across the land, I understood the true nature of my existence. I was not a savior. I was not a hero. I was the harbinger of the end. I was the flame that would burn the world to the ground and rebuild it in the image of the Ember Plains, a world of fire, of destruction, and of endless hunger. The creatures, the fire, the storms, they were not my creations. They were my legacy. The Ember Plains were not just a place. They were a force, And now they would consume everything. There was no going back now. The fire had already spread too far, and the world would burn. And I would walk among the flames forever,